All right, this is Human Development, Section B lecture. Our prioritized standards are for C, D, E, F, and G. Objectively, we're going to analyze the various stages of physical development. Now, the prenatal period of physical development spans the 9 months between conception and birth. After conception, the zygote, which is a fertilized egg, begins to grow through cell division. And after enough divisions take place, which is usually somewhere around 150, attaches itself into the lining of the uterus and then becomes an embryo. And the embryo is a developing organism during the first 8 weeks after conception. Now, this process usually takes about 10 days from conception to becoming an embryo. Now, during the embryonic phase, in a process known as specialization, the embryo cells begin to specialize as components of particular organ systems. So prior to this differentiation, certain cells in the embryo, known as embryonic stem cells, are capable of forming into any organ of the human body. Now, the process of cell division and differentiation continues throughout the prenatal period, producing all of the tissues and organs of the body. So the first rudimentary behaviors that you're going to notice is a heartbeat that appears at about 3 weeks when the embryo is about 1/8 of an inch long. Now, after the 8th week, the embryo actually becomes referred to as a fetus, which is the developing organism between the embryonic stage and birth. You're going to notice spontaneous movements commanded by the somatic nervous system that begin about this time. But they're not actually going to be felt by the mother until about 16 weeks. Now, from birth through the first month of life, the child enters the neonatal period, when the child is referred to as a neonate, or more simply, a newborn. Now, while the placenta, going back to pre-birth, is the organ interface between the embryo or fetus and the mother, while the embryo does allow for the exchange of nutrients and waste materials and actually screens out some potentially dangerous substances, some substances can actually pass through the placenta, which are known as teratogens. Now, teratogens are substances from the environment, which include things like viruses, drugs, and other chemicals that can actually damage the developing organism during the prenatal period. The most common teratogens are going to be nicotine and alcohol, although there are many others. Now, the effects of teratogens vary from slight to devastating, depending on the type, amount of exposure, and the stage of prenatal development when the exposure occurs. For instance, things like fetal alcohol syndrome can occur in children of mothers who drank heavily during pregnancy. Symptoms can include intellectual disability, poor motor coordination, impaired attention, hyperactivity. So depending on when you're exposed to those different teratogens, there's certain times that are worse than others to be exposed to it. So I think like in this particular diagram, the red are the worst times, yellow, not necessarily good times, but potentially less severe consequences. Now, from birth and until adulthood, people undergo a process known as maturation, which is the process by which the genetic program manifests itself over time. Now, humans raised under adequate environmental conditions notice maturation following a predictable pattern. For instance, there's going to be a sequence for motor control where a child learns to walk without any special training, which is following a time-ordered pattern that is typically for all physically capable children. Now, environmental influences can have an impact on maturation, but not dramatically. Now, through infancy and childhood, physical development involves an alteration between active and inactive growth phases. Now, while some believe newborns, which is the developmental stage during the first month of life, again referred to as the neonatal period. Now, while some believe newborns are born as a blank slate, psychologists have actually determined that newborns have innate or inborn abilities for finding nourishment, innately knowing how to suckle a nipple, for instance, interacting with others. So the cooing and crying serves the tool of social interaction, avoiding harmful situations like recoiling from sour foods or rotten foods. But they are born with a lot of different types of innate abilities. Now, at birth, newborns are capable of responding to stimulation from all of their senses. They do prefer human voices over other sounds. They actually have a preference for female voices over male ones. While born nearsighted with about 20 to 500 vision, their vision is optimized for recognizing human faces and different types of facial features. So that's why babies are so excited about looking at your face, because it's one of the few things they can actually make out. Now, newborns have behavioral reflexes, including a postural reflex that allows babies to sit with support, and a grasping reflex, enabling them to cling to a caregiver, and several others, as you'll see with this graphic here. Now, following the first month of life, the child enters infancy. That lasts until approximately 18 months of age, when the ability of speech is well developed. The Latin root infans actually means incapable of speech. So that's the primary goal you're aiming for at the end of infancy. Now, infancy is a time of rapid genetic program growth with a heavy reliance on reflexes and instinctive behaviors. So neural axons and dendrites are going to grow new connections, which leads to the total mass of the neural tissue of the brain to increase very rapidly over this time period. It's going to increase by about 50% in the first 2 years of life. It'll eventually nearly double in its birth size by the time the child is age 4, at least for most. And for the first few years of life, many brain circuits aren't going to be fully connected, helping explain the poor memories that most people are going to have for events that happened before they were about 3.5 years old. So if you can remember anything before 3.5, that probably means you had a lot of neural connections that were made at an earlier point in life. Now, learning actually assumes a role in development, with much learned through classical conditioning, where one learns by making associations with sensory events. So, for instance, babies quickly learn to manipulate parents by cooing, smiling, and crying. Learning and memory are going to underlie the ability of newborns to imitate simple facial expressions, so like sticking out a tongue, rounding of the mouth. They can usually manipulate a lot of those. Now, following infancy, the next stage of physical development is known as childhood, which is signified by the development of motor skills, language skills, and continued physical growth. Children gain proficiency in motor skills like walking, running, climbing, feeding, dressing themselves, manipulating objects like crayons or pencils, toilet training, tying shoes, and other types of motor skills. Children continue to gain advanced language skills like being able to carry on conversations and begin to be able to read. Now, the proficiency is obviously going to continue into adulthood, but that early ability at this point. Now, children continue to physically grow and maturing, although nowhere near as fast as they did when they were infants. This development is going to continue into a period that's known as adolescence. So adolescence is a developmental period beginning at puberty and ending at adulthood. Now, one of the first signs of approaching adolescence is the pubescent growth spurt that's going to occur about 2 to 3 years before they reach puberty, which is the onset of sexual maturity. Now, at puberty, the primary sex characteristics undergo dramatic change with the maturation of sexual organs and genitals. This is going to occur between the ages of 11 and 15 for females with the onset of menstruation, and at about 15 or 14 rather in males with the production of live sperm. Now, at puberty, there are changes among secondary sex characteristics, including the enlargement of breasts, the widening of hips in females, and also the deepening of the voice and the appearance of facial hair in males. Now, adolescents become overly concerned with their body image, which is one's personal and subjective view of one's own appearance. Now, body image is not dependent upon only measurable features, like your height or your weight, but it's also going to be based on perceptions of other people's assessments and also on cultural standards of beauty. Adolescent females, their self concepts are often going to be tied to perceptions of their physical attractiveness, while males seem to be more concerned with their physical prowess and athleticism. Differences may mirror rather a cultural preoccupation with female beauty or one of male strength. Now, by the time people reach early adulthood, physical maturation is complete, although height and weight may possibly still alter for some. Yet the aging process actually begins. So you spend all that time growing up, getting to where you're supposed to be, and then it's the slow process of death. In early adulthood, between the ages of about 20 and 40, our physical abilities are at their peak, including your muscle strength, reaction time, sensory abilities, and cardiac functioning. And many adults will reproduce, having children of their own. But the aging process also does begin at this stage that is caused by both primary biological factors, like the decline of cellular function, and also secondary environmental functions or factors, like having an unhealthy lifestyle. At about the age 25, the brain becomes actually fully developed, finally, at this point. And around age 30, there are going to be changes in the body that are going to be associated with aging. So at this point, for a lot of people, they'll start to notice diminished vision, usually affecting their ability to focus on close objects, decreasing sensitivity to sound, which happens more quickly to men than women, thinning or graying of the hair, often seen around the age of 35, skin becomes drier and starts to wrinkle. Those are going to start to appear. Also, the immune system is also going to start to decline. So you're going to be less adept at fighting off illnesses once you reach early adulthood than you did at all the other stages. And also, the reproductive capacity will start to decline, although not immediately, but certainly toward the end of early adulthood. Now, during middle adulthood, which is going to be between the ages of roughly 40 and 65, the aging process becomes more apparent. Many of the signs of aging that were first noticed during early adulthood are going to begin to accelerate. Around age 50, women experience menopause that ends the menstrual cycle and also the ability to reproduce. And then, during late adulthood, the aging process is going to further accelerate until, sadly, you reach the point of death. All right, that concluded Human Development, Section B lecture. Our prioritized standards again were 4C, D, E, F, and G. And objectively, now you can analyze the various stages of physical development.